The ocean off the coast of Argentina was always restless, as if it were trying to hide what lay at the very bottom. A group of abyssal scavengers, 4 friends driven not by a love of history, but by a feverish greed, had finally found what they had been hunting for years. There was Mark, a former Marine with eyes like chips of ice. Jules, a technical genius who saw the world through a sonar screen. Eric, a mountain of muscle who feared nothing but poverty. And Lana, a woman who could coax a secret out of any safe ever built. Rising from the silt before them was the Admiral Spee, a heavy cruiser of the Kriegsmarine, officially scuttled by its own crew in 1939. But it didn't look blown up. It looked as if it had simply decided to step beneath the waves, keeping its cargo and its passengers perfectly preserved.
We're entering through a breach in the stern.
As they stepped onto the deck inside the hull, the water simply vanished. It was impossible, but they were standing in a dry corridor filled with heavy, stagnant air. The atmosphere reeked of diesel, bleach, and very old, stale tobacco.
Look!
Lana pointed her flashlight at the wall.
Even the paint hasn't peeled.
Ideological posters hung on the walls, but the faces of the people on them had been erased, as if someone had painstakingly scraped them away with a knife. They moved toward the mess hall. Plates with stale bread sat on the tables. Half-smoked cigarettes still smoldered in ashtrays. It felt as though the crew had just stepped out a minute ago.
"Where's the gold, Mark?"
Eric asked nervously, his hand white-knuckled around his knife.
"The captain's cabin had a safe. That's where we go."
But the further they went, the more the ship began to wake up. These weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. These were echoes. Mark heard a distant command barked in German. Then, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of heavy boots on iron. Suddenly, their flashlights began to dim. The corridor stretched, becoming an infinite metal tunnel.
Eric?
Lana called out. But it wasn't Eric standing beside her. In her beam of light, she saw a young German sailor in a grease-stained uniform. His face was identical to Eric's, but his eyes were bloated with blood, and a thick black fluid leaked from his ears.
"Guten Abend, Claire,"
the sailor whispered, using Eric's voice. Lana screamed, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the sudden, deafening roar of a siren. The ship was no longer a sunken ruin. The walls began to shift, rust vanished, giving way to fresh, slate-gray paint. The overhead lights flickered to life with a bright, deathly white glare.
"What is happening?"
Mark yelled, only to find that his wetsuit had been replaced by a heavy, wool officer's tunic. An iron cross glinted on his chest. Eric stood by a bulkhead, desperately trying to tear his own hands away from a rusted valve that he was now turning with impossible mechanical strength. His muscles bulged. The veins in his neck were on the verge of bursting.
I can't stop,"
he shrieked. His role was the mechanic. He had to maintain the pressure in a boiler that had rotted away decades ago. Jules had vanished. Her voice drifted from the ship's intercom, but she wasn't speaking. She was screaming target coordinates, her voice twisted into the screech of radio interference. Lana was in the captain's cabin. She saw the safe she had craved. She lunged for it, but instead of gold, she found hundreds of letters. When she touched one, the paper sliced into her fingers like a razor. Blood began to drip onto the pages, and the paper began to drink it.
"You are the signal officer, Claire."
Mark's voice sounded behind her. But it wasn't Mark. It was Captain Hans Schmidt. His hand, encased in a pristine white glove, settled on her shoulder.
Write the reply. We are to die soon.
Mark tried to fight it. Inside the captain's tunic, he felt his own skin beginning to age, felt the cancer in his lungs that had plagued the real Captain Schmidt back in 45. The ship demanded authenticity. He stumbled onto the bridge. The sonar screen showed dozens of enemy destroyers closing in.
We have to get out!
Mark screamed into the void.
This isn't our life! Eric! Jules!
He ran into the engine room. It was a literal hell. The temperature was so high that the skin on Eric's face was peeling away in layers, like old wallpaper. Eric continued to crank the white-hot valve.
Mark, help me.
He rasped. His eyes had already been boiled white by the steam.
The pressure has to go, or we won't make it.
Mark saw Jules. She had been integrated into the radio station. Wires had grown through her wrists, fusing with the circuit boards. Her mouth was stretched open by metal clamps, so she could endlessly shout frequencies. She was no longer a person. She was a component.
The ship doesn't want your gold.
Lana whispered, emerging from the darkness. Her fingers were worn down to the bone from writing letters.
It needs replacements. It's tired of dying alone. Now we die instead of them.
Suddenly, the ship shuddered. The first torpedo hit. Metal groaned, and water began to rush into the corridors. But it wasn't the salt water of the Atlantic. It was hot, oily blood that smelled of the deaths of 200 German sailors. Mark saw Lana and Eric disappear into the torrent, but they didn't drown. They became part of the metal. Their screams became the screeching of the hull.
Out! Get out!
Mark roared.
The safe! Lana, the safe was the key!
He lunged back into the captain's cabin. The safe was open. Inside lay a Luger pistol and a single gold watch. On the watch was a date, February 11th, 2026. Today's date. Mark realized time on this ship wasn't linear. It was a noose, tightening around the neck of anyone who dared disturb the Spee. He grabbed the watch and saw his reflection in the glass. He was old, gray-haired, and from his lips fell a prayer in German. A bulkhead gave way. Impact. Darkness. He woke up to someone pulling him by the shoulders.
Kid, breathe. Breathe, damn it.
A gruff voice shouted. Mark opened his eyes. The sun blinded him. He was lying on the deck of a modern rescue boat. People in orange vests moved around him. The Argentine Coast Guard.
We picked up your signal.
The officer said.
You're the only one who surfaced. What happened down there? Where are your friends?
Mark wanted to tell them. He wanted to speak of the rust, of Jules, of Eric becoming part of the boiler. But when he opened his mouth, dry sawdust and tiny metal shards spilled out. He looked at his hands. They were young. His wetsuit was on. Everything looked as if he had escaped.
My friends!
He began in English, but his voice suddenly shifted into the creaking, ancient rasp of Captain Schmidt.
They stayed at their posts. A ship cannot sink without its crew.
The officer flinched. Mark looked at the horizon. There, beneath the waves, he saw a dark oil slick spreading across the water. He reached into his pocket and found the gold watch. The hands were moving normally now, but instead of numbers, there were names. Lana, Eric, Jules, and his own name, Mark, was next, slowly fading to make room for someone new. He looked at the Coast Guard officer.
Do you like old ships, sir?
Mark asked, and for a split second, his eyes flashed with that same white, dead light from the Admiral Spee.
There's something down there much more valuable than gold. Would you like to see?
The officer looked into Mark's eyes and saw not a man, but an endless iron corridor where the lights never go out. He couldn't look away. At the bottom of the ocean, the Admiral Spee began preparing new cabins. It was always short on crew.
It's been 3 days since we picked up that survivor near the Admiral Spee site. The man, Mark Turner, was cleared by medical and released, but something stayed behind in the air of this cabin. It's the smell. No matter how much I scrub the deck, I can still smell diesel, cold iron, and old, wet wool. I haven't slept. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back on that rescue boat, looking into his eyes. He said there was something more valuable than gold down there. I thought he was talking about artifacts. I thought he was just another shell-shocked diver. But tonight, the radio in the command center started acting up. It wasn't the usual white noise. It was a rhythmic tapping. Short, short, short. Long, long, long. SOS. But it was followed by a voice. A girl's voice, clear as a bell, coming through a frequency that hasn't been used since the war.
Officer Miller, the captain is asking for the evening report. Your cabin is ready. It's a bit cold, but the view of the abyss is infinite.
I looked in the mirror. My eyes, they're starting to look milky, pale, like I've spent a lifetime staring at light bulbs that never burn out. I'm not heading back to the base. I've already turned the boat around. The coordinates are burned into my mind, glowing like white-hot wires. The ocean isn't restless today. It's waiting. It's opening up like a hungry iron mouth. And for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the dark. I'm just ready to go on duty.